listen up. We've got a war zone here today, right in our heartland. And across the USA, these multinational bastards don't use tanks and guns, it's true. But they've declared a war on us, fight back, it's up to you. Oh, it's a war on the workers. War on the workers. Oh, it's a war on the workers. War on the workers. Oh, it's a war on the workers. And it's time we started calling the shots.
Welcome to System Change, Not Climate Change, the Ecosocialist Network. Today, our presenters are authors of a piece in Dissent magazine entitled, "To Win a Green New Deal, Pass the PRO Act." The PRO Act is a federal bill that will dramatically improve labor laws in this country, which are among the worst in the wealthy nations. The PRO Act repeals right-to-work laws across the country, thereby enabling unions to collect dues from the workers they represent. It outlaws union busting in many ways, reinforces the right to strike, enhances unions' bargaining strength, and expands protections for undocumented workers. It is the single biggest piece of pro-worker legislation in generations. For the past few months, the Democratic Socialists of America's Green New Deal campaign has made passing the PRO Act its top priority. Here to explain why are two radical eco-socialists who are leading the charge. Sydney Ghazarian and Ashik Siddique are coordinators of DSA's Green New Deal and PRO-Ad campaigns. Sydney is a founder of DSA's Eco-Socialist Working Group and has worked for years to establish climate justice as a primary focus of the American left. Ashik presently serves on the steering committee of DSA's Eco-Socialist Working Group. He's a research analyst at the Institute for Policy Studies and a founding member of the Climate Mobilization. Welcome, Sydney and Ashik.
Thank you so much for having us. We are so excited to be here with you all today. As Ted said, my name is Sydney, and thank you, System Change, Not Climate Change, for having me and Ashik on today. Ted already gave you a brief overview of what's in the PRO Act, which is our main campaign right now, but I'm going to go into a little bit more detail. Then Ashik is going to overview the connection between the fight for the Green New Deal and the fight for the PRO Act, the connection between eco-socialism and labor, and then we're going to talk a little bit about DSA's campaign. So let's go ahead and get started. Ashik, are you ready to share the slides? Awesome. So let's go ahead and get started. The Protecting the Right to Organize Act, or PRO Act, is an important piece of labor legislation, perhaps the most significant piece of labor legislation we've seen in decades, as Ted said earlier. It would undo many punitive laws that prevent workers from collectively organizing on behalf of their needs, which therefore undermines wages, workplace safety, healthcare, benefits, and our power to contest the capitalist class. The PRO Act would make it illegal for employers to replace striking workers, outlaw captive audience anti-union meetings held by employers, and prevent misclassification of independent contractors, which would allow more workers to access the benefits of a union. It would also prohibit retaliation by employers against workers seeking to form a union, and gives authority to the National Labor Relations Act to fine and penalize employers engaging in such unfair labor practices. And that would have made a big difference in, for example, Bessemer, Alabama's union drive. The PRO Act would create a mediation and arbitration process to ensure newly formed unions reach a first contract. And that's really, really important because right now, even when workers succeed in forming a union, nearly half of newly formed unions fail to ever reach a contract with the employer because the employers often drag out the process and can make it nearly impossible for workers to succeed. The PRO Act would also lift the prohibition on secondary strikes, which prevents the union from going on strike in solidarity with other unions. The ban on solidarity strikes also legally prevents unions from participating in actual strikes in solidarity with movements. So lifting the ban could create the possibility of climate strikes or the BLM Strike for Our Lives Day of Action becoming actual strikes, which would add new power to our movements. And the PRO Act would also undo the single most destructive Supreme Court decision for immigrant workers in this country. Immigrants are supposed to have the same rights as citizens when it comes to collectively bargaining, and the National Labor Relations Act, but a Supreme Court decision ruled that workers who aren't here legally aren't entitled to back pay and all the same rights as other workers. The capitalist class uses this to divide immigrants and US-born workers, and it creates a dynamic where immigrants are often underpaid, exploited, abused, and threatened with deportation, which prevents them from speaking out and organizing to achieve a work environment they are deserving of, work with dignity and justice. The PRO Act would also overturn right to work laws that currently exist in 27 states. Right to work laws are designed to weaken unions by allowing workers to gain all the benefits of being in a union, like higher wages, job security, and representation before management without paying union dues. And the bosses will tell you that union dues serves as like a tax on workers, but the benefits of being a union member far outweigh the small cost of union dues. And when funding comes from member dues, members make the decision, not outside interests. And that's extremely important in our movement. The reality is that right to work laws are a relic of Jim Crow and were introduced in the 1940s South by powerful business groups that were terrified that multiracial labor unions would pose a threat to racial segregation. In the 1930s, communists, socialists, and wobblies built a more powerful US labor movement in part by organizing Black and white industrial workers to form unions together, in defiance of some craft unions that formally excluded Black workers from their membership. In 1935, the Wagner Act, also known as the National Labor Relations Act, passed, which greatly expanded the ability of workers to form unions. And this catalyzed the shift from the labor movement primarily being made up of white men and highly skilled crafts to unions primarily consisting of Black, brown, and women workers today. And for obvious reasons, white supremacists and big businesses hated this, which is why they lobbied and won right to work laws, which are undermining workers in 27 states today. This history is also why the fight against the right to work laws have historically been embedded in the fight for civil rights. Recognizing the racist origin of these laws, Martin Luther King Jr. said, "In our glorious fight for civil rights, we must guard against being fooled by false slogans such as right to work. It is a law to rob us of our civil rights and job rights. It is supported by Southern segregationists who are trying to keep us from achieving our civil rights and our right to equal job opportunity. Its purpose is to destroy labor unions and the freedom of collective bargaining by which unions have improved wages and working conditions for everyone." So now that I've given you a bit of an overview of the PRO Act, I'm going to turn it over to Ashik to talk a little bit more about the connection to the Green New Deal.
Yeah, thanks, Sydney, and thanks again to everybody for being here. So I apologize for the slide that I put up. That's somewhat disturbing. I put it there because I'm sure, as people who are highly engaged in climate politics, you've seen a lot about how the Biden administration is being presented in terms of climate as the most ambitious climate administration ever, which is true, but it's also a very low bar, as most of you know. DSA has been organizing for a Green New Deal against the climate crisis, which we understand as a program for massive public investments that we need to very quickly transform all our systems, energy, buildings, transit, away from fossil fuels to clean renewable energy, and create millions of good jobs while doing that, to do all the important work that we need to win a future where everyone can survive and thrive. So where we are now is, a straight up climate denier is no longer president. That's great. Democrats who admit that climate change is real have a slim majority in Congress. And in Biden's first 2 weeks in office, he's already re-entered the Paris Climate Agreement. He's canceled the Keystone Pipeline, done a bunch of good things that more or less reestablished the status quo at the end of Obama's presidency. There are a bunch of big commitments, like recently the Biden jobs plan was put out that commits over $2 trillion to green infrastructure, which is certainly not the limit of our ambition, but it's a good start. It would lay the groundwork, if it passes, to starting to reshape the entire physical landscape of this country over the next decade, which, again, is better than what we had a year ago. But there are really big questions about what terms that those investments happen on. Like, where do those trillions of dollars go? Is it going to be to capitalists like Elon Musk and Tesla and Uber and Lyft, all these big corporations who are promising to green capitalism while they're also lobbying to bust down labor rights for millions of workers? Could it actually find new ways to exploit workers and frontline communities within US borders and across the global South? Or could some of these investments happen in ways that actually build working class power in the US and around the world and actually start to repair the ongoing harms of capitalism and colonialism? Right now, I'll just say that the commitments in this plan are not adequate to doing all that. There's a lot that has to be contested, which is why the PRO Act is such a big focus. And I'll just add that, for like, I take all this very personally, like the prospects for rebuilding working class power in the US. My family is from Bangladesh. They immigrated before I was born to the US. That's one of the countries that is already being hit hardest by rising sea levels, and its economy is pretty much entirely also driven by exporting garments. In many ways, it's like a capitalist success story in terms of how fast its economy is growing. But there are just incredible contradictions. So to a large extent, the industrial working class of the 21st century is in global South countries, in Asia, Africa, Latin America. In order for people in those societies to be able to survive the climate crisis, it's really important to rebuild internationalist working class power, which includes in the heart of empire in the US. So we see all these struggles as very linked. And that relates to how we're messaging this campaign for the PRO Act, which is workers and the world unite, which is a bit of a riff on Marx. Workers of the world unite, because we know that empowering workers and saving the planet should be the same political project. We have to directly refute the idea of an inherent trade-off between addressing climate change and material improvements and dignity for the working class. So instead, we actually see an empowered working class as our only hope of winning transformative policies like a Green New Deal. And what we're doing in drawing out these links in our campaign is really important, because for decades, climate and environmental organizing has been pretty dominated by nonprofit organizations that in many ways have done fine jobs of running campaigns that are focused on media and communication strategies that have been effective in a bunch of ways. They've been effective at mobilizing large numbers of people for big actions. But some deeper forms of organizing have been lacking, including organizing based in institutions that large numbers of working class people live and work in, including and especially labor unions. And this is not unique to the environmental movement. It's true of like all movements for the past few decades when the left has been in retreat and organized labor has been on the defense. And that's a big reason why the right wing has been ascendant for so long. As many of you know, when mass movements were stronger in the US in the past and able to win big advances like the New Deal, like civil rights, like women's rights, like environmental protections throughout the 60s and 70s, a big part of that was that labor unions were part of a strong institutional backbone for a broader organized left that had the power to fight for and win big advances. If we're being really real, there are plenty of powerful forces in and around the Democratic Party who have seen labor unions as just another interest group to check off a list, and recently an increasingly disposable one. It's much easier to work with, progressive, like nonprofit organizations that are ultimately funded by, many of the same capitalists who are causing this crisis. There's been a big focus on optics and, the appearance of movement energy that are often just driven toward electoral goals that don't have substantial and lasting organized bases. So one of the big challenges toward winning a Green New Deal or any kind of big public investments toward meeting climate goals is that workers in key sectors are not organized. We know that we need to shift to 100% renewable energy. And already, just based on market conditions, wind and solar energy jobs are growing very quickly and are the fastest growing sectors of energy, new energy, growing much more quickly than gas, or like coal is on the way out. It's already on its last legs, but it's going to be very hard to achieve a much faster transition unless more workers in renewable energy sectors are unionized. And right now they're unionized at lower rates than in fossil fuel sectors. And even in fossil fuel sectors, only about, I think, 1/10 of workers are unionized. So it's a pretty low bar already. workers are pitted against each other and, you know, have been sort of forced to like beg for scraps. And it's just, you know, it's just been a negative feedback loop for a long time. So we need to change that cycle, and stronger labor organizing is crucial to that. And this is just a chart that sort of lays it all out, why the PRO Act is so important. This is a chart of labor militancy during the original New Deal, measured by strike actions. So you can see that all throughout the 20s and 30s, there are huge numbers of strikes that increase throughout the decade of the New Deal. And a lot of the big gains of the New Deal were won because of militant organized labor making radical demands and organizing lots of people. And you know, capital had to compromise for fear of actual revolution. And as these victories were won throughout that decade, workers kept raising expectations and getting even more organized for even more expansive demands. They were not complacent or pacified. And they were so successful that, you know, by 1947, at the end of the war, the Taft-Hartley Act was passed to kneecap the radicalism of labor. And, you know, it's been downhill ever since. So the labor movement is historically weak now, but in some ways, there are positive signs, or, you know, signs that this kind of energy can rebuild. Like unionization rates right now are actually comparable to what they were at the beginning of the Great Depression. And, you know, that's a baseline to work from. So this kind of, like, in a nutshell, summarizes the theory of change that we have for this decade. Much as in the 1930s, militant labor organizing helped win the National Labor Relations Act, which further enabled even more worker organizing, and that won a lot of the big New Deal demands. And we think that in the same way, it's going to be a big fight to win the PRO Act. And then if we do, it'll enable even more, and that will make Green New Deal demands possible to win. Yeah, this has been what we've been working on, and that's why this is such a big focus. In a nutshell, to win a Green New Deal, we need an organized working class and militant labor movement to meet the magnitude of the moment. And we, like Ted mentioned, we lay out a bunch of the arguments for this in this article that somebody can drop in the chat. And I will hand it back to Sydney to talk a little bit about how the campaign has been working.
Thanks, Ashik. So I think it's pretty clear that we as eco-socialists believe in this fight, and that is why DSA has made passing the Protecting the Right to Organize, or PRO Act, its top priority, at least through May, though we plan on continuing the campaign beyond that. This campaign is being led by a combination of leadership from the Democratic Socialist Labor Commission and Green New Deal Campaign Committee, which is part of the National DSA Eco-Socialist Working Group. This campaign has been one of the most momentous campaigns that DSA has ever undertaken, starting with the largest mass call in DSA's history, featuring speakers such as Sarah Nelson, Naomi Klein, and Jamal Bowman. And we've had weekly action and campaign trainings where hundreds of DSA members have learned how to plan actions, how to organize strategic campaigns, and how to organize their unions and co-workers as part of the campaign. Our coaching team is supporting chapters across the country. Our comms team keeps turning out these amazing graphics, op-eds, and videos, and at least 78 chapters are currently gearing up for actions, planned actions, done actions, and at least 39 are considering it or in the early planning stages. DSA is also currently serving in a leadership capacity in a national coalition with unions and progressive organizations such as our friends IUPAT and CWA. Our chapters are organizing with union locals, even putting on joint events to promote the PRO Act while supporting striking workers in their towns. And during our week of phone banking action, members from 184 different chapters made over 500,000 calls and left hundreds of messages for Democratic senators who had yet to sign on for the PRO Act. As of today, we've made over 650,000 calls. We've totally flooded their voicemails many, many times over. And those calls are actually paying off, but I'll talk about that more in a second. Before I get there, I want to just mention that back in March, DSA had announced that a big day of action for this campaign will be May 1st, International Workers' Day. And at least 65 chapters are prepping for May Day actions to win the PRO Act. And our coalition partners have aligned with our timeline and intend to join us in taking action on May 1st. And even as of a few weeks ago, the AFL-CIO has even decided to direct all of their locals and feds to throw down for the PRO Act on May Day. So May Day will be a really significant day for this campaign, as well as a celebration for working people everywhere. And quite frankly, we have a lot to celebrate. Next. So thousands of DSA members have thrown down for the PRO Act, and our work is paying off. Both Senator Angus King and Senator Joe Manchin have explicitly cited the hundreds of calls they received as the reason they caved and endorsed the PRO Act. In less than 2 months, DSA has thrown down for this campaign. We have flipped 2 senators to support the most important piece of labor legislation this country has seen in decades. And our work is just getting started. We still need to flip the 3 holdout Democratic senators in order to even get the PRO Act on the Senate floor. However, Biden has added the PRO Act to his infrastructure package, which is also promising historic investments in green energy infrastructure during a critical point in the climate emergency. As Ashik mentioned, it's not enough, but it's important. It's an important point of intervention for ecosocialists everywhere. Because how much and who benefits from this package is up for grabs, as is the fate of workers in the world. And as we have demonstrated throughout this campaign so far, DSA is ready to fight, the left is ready to fight, and May Day is going to be an important part in gearing up for that campaign. So I am really, really excited about this campaign, and I hope that you all decide to plug in with us. I didn't include the link for this one, but if you're interested in just signing up for regular updates on the campaign, you can go to bit.ly/PROACT-signup. That you can also access the DSA chapter guide if you're interested in how to organize different things related to chapter events there. But I would really, really encourage you all to do actions, do teach-ins, do phone banks, do something like this, which is amazing. And thank you so much, System Change, Not Climate Change, for having us here. I'd also really, really encourage you to sign up for phone banks. Obviously, the phone banks are working. They really don't like getting hundreds and hundreds of calls from us. It's annoying them a lot. As you might be able to tell from Kristen Sinema, she's getting a little on edge from all the calls, and we plan on escalating pressure in other ways as well. And I also really, really encourage you to turn out for May Day actions. So as I said before, May Day is going to be a huge event, not just for DSA, but unions across this country have aligned for fighting for the PRO Act on May Day. And I hope that System Change, Not Climate Change joins us in the streets. And if you're not feeling comfortable coming to the streets, because we are still in the middle of a pandemic, we will be having a big event, a text banking and phone banking event with a few celebrities if you want to join us there. We'll have the link later on. But that's it from us. I really hope you plug into this campaign. Thank you so much for having us. And of course, workers and the world unite. Thanks.
Thank you, Sydney and Ashik. That was a great overview of what's going on with DSA's campaign and the campaign generally for the PRO Act and why it's so important to our vision of trying to get to the kind of power we need in order to be able to implement a Green New Deal and a just transition. I'm going to now pass the baton to Maura Stevens. Maura is my fellow System Change, Not Climate Change coordinating team member and a member of the National Writers Union and other unions. She is an independent journalist, a writer, a farmer, a theater artist, a vegan chef, and an educator at the university and community levels. And Maura will be taking us through a number of questions for Sydney and Ashik.
Thanks, Ted. That was really a terrific overview, really succinct and comprehensive. Some of the questions that we had lined up in advance, you've already answered. But I just wanted to, since you mentioned the senators, especially Kirsten Sinema of Arizona, and Mark Kelly is the other one who's holding out on the Democratic side. She just announced that she was going to be listening to employers' points of view against the PRO Act. And she hasn't, to my knowledge, said anything about listening to employees. How should we be targeting her specifically? Those of us who aren't living in Arizona obviously don't have the clout that an Arizonan would, but give us some advice on that, please, and tell us how DSA is going about it.
Yeah, that's a great question. And this is why the structure of our phone banks is really important, because it's not just, random DSA people from like New York and East Bay, calling Kristen Sinema's office directly. We're calling lists of voters in that state to have conversations with them and activate them to leave messages on Kristen Sinema and Mark Kelly's inboxes and call them directly. So this is really about calling lots of people who are their constituents to make those contacts. Whether or not, so like a portion of the people who we make contacts with are leaving those messages, but even the ones who don't are having, pretty meaningful conversations about the importance of organized labor and rebuilding it. So like the direct goal is to activate people to make those contacts, but also it's just about like building a baseline of contact about this being a real issue in your state, so that like right now and then like certainly toward the next election, that's in their minds, and like that just lays the groundwork for unions in that state to just like really like publicly make it a big deal that their senators are not supporting this crucial litmus test.
Yeah, and I'm just going to add really quickly and candidly to that. One thing that I think is important is that Mark Kelly has been kind of a pain about it as well, but Kristen Sinema is making herself look awful, right? And Mark Kelly has an election coming up, and it is not smart for Mark Kelly to take Kristen Sinema's side right now. We need to make it clear he needs to distance himself from her by endorsing the PRO Act, and that will also put more pressure on her, because right now they are having this alliance where like, no, I'm not going to support it because the other senator from Arizona is not supporting it, so I can't abandon them. But Mark Kelly needs to abandon her and start supporting the PRO Act. He's made up a lot of excuses. They're becoming weaker and weaker as his election is fast approaching, and he's going to need the support of unions and of working people in order to be elected. He is going to start questioning that. So we need to start making sure that he knows that by supporting Kristen Sinema and not supporting the PRO Act, he is alienating himself. And I think that will add, if he does endorse the PRO Act, I think that will add pressure to Kristen Sinema.
Shame can be a very powerful tool. And so we have quite a few union members on this call that I recognize at least. And can you give us a brief rundown of which unions have not endorsed the PRO Act? Which unions, are there any like the bigger unions that we should be targeting especially?
I don't know which unions are not supporting the PRO Act. I know that there are some unions that are throwing down harder than others, right? And I think that's maybe a point that you can move them on. I think some, like IUPAT is throwing down really hard. They're on the steering committee of the National Coalition with us. CWA is throwing down really hard. And I don't know names of unions that have not supported it off the top of my head. I think this is generally people are like, yes, this is a good thing. But we as like rank and file members in unions or, whatever can actually move things within our unions and say like, we should be doing more on this issue. And I would suggest that, because even I think, for example, the AFL-CIO, they were originally just going to mostly support the stimulus, though they supported the PRO Act sort of passively. But because of all of the work that's been put into this, all of the other unions that are throwing behind it, they recently announced that they are going to have a week of action leading up to May Day and throwing down for the PRO Act explicitly on May Day. So I think just, using your position within your union to push your union to fight harder for the PRO Act is something that you can do.
Sydney, so you mentioned IUPAT, but many folks who are on the call may not know that what those initials stand for, as well as you mentioned CWA, and what can you talk a little bit about the significance of those unions, and in particular the IUPAT being from the building trades?
Well, that is the significance. They are from the building trades. IUPAT stands for the International Union of Painters and Allied Trades, and they are a sort of smaller but important building trades union, right? And we know as ecosocialists, as climate activists, that the building trades and climate activists have been pit against each other for decades. And this is absolutely devastating for our movement. However, IUPAT has been throwing down really, really hard. They have extremely progressive leadership compared to a lot of other building trade unions right now. They recently joined the Blue-Green Alliance. And so we're seeing a lot of movement from them, and it's really significant in this moment, especially with the infrastructure bill coming up. CWA is Communication Workers of America.
But they're a lot broader than just any, they've really broadened out.
Yes, they have a lot of different people in their union. They're a big union. They have a lot of members. And so it's pretty significant for them to join this fight as well. But of course, for obvious reasons, for climate activists, having a building trades ally is pretty significant in this moment.
So one of the biggest industry that we as eco-socialists are concerned with, of course, is the oil and gas and fossil fuel industry. And someone pointed out here, I've been particularly engaged with fossil fuel workers for the past decade plus, fighting fossil fuel infrastructure, fracking, and the incredible numbers, tens of thousands of miles of pipelines and the related ills that go on. And most of those workers don't seem to recognize the import of a bill such as this that could really help them. And most of them don't realize the dangers of their job until one of their corporations goes belly up, as many of them have been doing, or until they get violently ill themselves from some of the toxins that they've been exposed to. So in my experience, it's been really hard one-on-one, working in individual conversations one-on-one with people to make them understand how a bill like this could benefit them and how organizing could benefit them. Can you talk a little bit about the import of that industry and the just transition in that industry and how that ties into the PRO Act and the Green New Deal?
Yeah, that's a really great set of questions. I think one of the things to keep in mind is that in the fastest growing sectors of the energy industry, in electric power generation, solar and wind account for the largest portion of jobs already by energy type in the sector. And many of those jobs are misclassified. So they're classified as contractors, not as employees, which means that they are robbed of the ability to form unions and receive fair benefits and wages, and also don't have access to the environmental protections that unionized workforce would have in those sectors. So passing the PRO Act would make it harder to misclassify clean energy construction workers and make it easier for them to form unions and bargain for better wages and benefits. It's definitely a challenge to communicate all that, and I can't speak to organizing with workers to advance that. Like labor organizers in DSA could speak better to that, but that's really the framing that we want to push very heavily about why the PRO Act would be such a meaningful intervention. And regarding the just transition, this is why demonstrating like real public sector investments is so important, because many workers in fossil fuel and extractive sectors, pretty justifiably, don't trust the promises of politicians when it comes to just transition is already kind of a poison phrase in many communities, just because it's there have been decades of false promises to that end. So it's going to be really important when we're talking about these big infrastructure investments to really demonstrate how it can happen in ways that empower workers and create good new jobs. So that's kind of a tangled response to your questions, but I think that set of things is really important to keep emphasizing and figure out how to demonstrate politically.
Is there any target by DSA toward the workers in those industries? Is there any formal campaign working on that?
Not particularly to those workers. I think during the pandemic, there have been some really good ongoing efforts to organize emergency work. What does the acronym stand for? It's emergency workers. To get workplace protections during the pandemic. So there's a lot of cool stuff happening there. You could check out their website. It's EWOC, EWOC. Actually, let me find the right website. But it's Emergency Workplace Organizing in DSA. So I think that is a good template for maybe further organizing, but we have not gotten to that point yet for clean energy.
Thanks. We have a really kind of a critical infrastructure question from David Klein, which is, given the filibuster, how many votes are needed in the Senate for the PRO Act to pass? Is it 60? And is there any pressure on Republican senators? Are there any Republican senators who would be worth pressuring, I guess, is a better question.
Filibuster is complicated. I'm not a nerd in this, so I could totally miss. You can correct me in the chat, that's fine. But my understanding is you just need a majority for it to pass, but the filibuster allows debate to just go on and on and on. So it needs 60 people to end debate so you could actually get to that vote. So yes, you technically do need 60, it's just complicated. But there are some different like parliamentarian tricks sort of things that you can do to abolish the filibuster, to amend the filibuster, like a mini nuke. And there's different things that you can do through reconciliation, which is important for the infrastructure package coming up, to create a new precedent for what is allowed to be passed through the budgeting process. And those are the types of like weird parliamentarian things that we're going to have to pay attention to here.
And are there any Republicans who are potentially swayable?
That's a great question. So for this stage of our campaign, we've been focusing on pressuring the 5 remaining Democrat caucus members, but because our DSA chapters have taken on a lot of initiative, a bunch of them have started pressuring some Republicans, like in Maine after Angus King flipped. They're now focusing on pressuring Susan Collins, who is a Republican who, in the past has gone, in different ways than the rest of the party. So, we're definitely not holding our breath, but we think it's definitely useful to, have our members and allies figure out how to pressure people in creative ways. I think Alaska is another example where a Republican, or maybe more than one in the House, have supported the PRO Act. So that could be because of the conditions in Alaska. Lisa Murkowski could be a target, but I don't want to get ahead of ourselves because that's beyond like what we nationally have planned yet. But there are a bunch of chapters that have taken on initiative to start building that pressure on Republicans as well.
Florida is also, I think, pressuring Marco Rubio right now because of his comments about Amazon and supporting the Amazon workers. Like, put your money where your mouth is. You need to sign on to the PRO Acts now.
How would speaking of Amazon, how would having a PRO Act have changed the outcome in Alabama, Bessemer?
Well, it would have made it illegal for Amazon to have done all the things they did to intimidate workers, to pressure them not to support the union. They're just like a whole checklist of union busting tactics that they did in ways that are really egregious and should be illegal, and the PRO Act would have made them like enforceably illegal. So I think that it would not have taken a year for workers to have put in all the work they did and then have the vote fail. Yeah, like fights like that would not be such big fights if the PRO Act were in place.
That same thing happened at the university where I spent 19 years recently, exactly the same scenario.
Yeah, there was an article, a really good article in Jacobin from Brandon Magner, who's been writing Labor Law Light on Substack. He has a blog there. And he went into all the detail about what would have been different in that campaign. And I think one of the biggest highlights that came through was the issue of captive audience presentations, which is where these consultants have manufactured like presentations that are designed to distract people from the real interests and get them pitted against the union. And employers are allowed to actually herd their employees into auditoriums, They could do it for 4 hours at a time and just do these multimedia presentations that have been tried on in union campaigns all over the country. And they have lots of friendly faces up on the screen, of people saying, of young workers saying, the reason I hate the union is it takes a big chunk out of my paycheck, or, et cetera. Or I don't like being told what to do. We have a way of communicating with our boss. So those meetings are very effective. I'm speaking now as sort of a resentful retired labor law professor, and just having gone through all of that with over the years, watching the effectiveness of this consulting industry. So I pass it back to Maura.
No, thanks. The reason I was chosen to ask the questions is that I'm not as knowledgeable as Ted. Ted is pretty much a walking encyclopedia of labor law and issues. And although I'm a union member, I've never really been an organizer within my unions. I'm too busy organizing on green, climate, peace, justice, and equity issues. So I've been grateful to be represented by a union in various fields. I'm actually a member or former member of 6 different unions. So I've benefited greatly from the union movement, as have so many other people. The Taft-Hartley bill is one of the biggest things that has served to crush the strength of unions over the past decades. Can you talk about whether or not there's any action to overthrow the Taft-Hartley Act, to negate it? And if not, why not? That question came from Michael Rubin.
Oh, so the PRO Act would repeal a lot of Taft-Hartley, not all of it. But the PRO Act is a step towards repealing it, because a lot of the actions it's taking is directly like confronting and changing Taft-Hartley provisions.
So, but not specifically to repeal it, just the portions of it that are involved in the PRO Act. Got it. So let's see, we're going to kind of transition over here to the Green New Deal a little bit, and talking about how DSA seems to have made the Green New Deal more of a goal than a first step. What was the thinking behind that?
I think that's a really interesting frame, right? Of a goal versus, our goal is eco-socialism. Our goal is to win the world and completely and utterly change it. We want international eco-socialism, and we think of the Green New Deal as a step there. But yes, the Green New Deal, I guess, in its own way is a goal as well, because, our power has been decimated for decades. The left is weak. We are gaining power, but we are not in power. And so I think the fight for the Green New Deal is how we build the left. It's how we build worker power. It is how we position ourselves in order to be able to, save the world so that we can win eco-socialism, but also so that we have the power to. And so I think it's just a matter of strategy and thinking through how are we building strategically and methodically and urgently to have the power we actually need to win.
And having some victory is empowering in itself. Only 11% of us are organized in unions as it is. And, that isn't a really strong movement, although we are told that somewhere between 5 and 6% of the people actively working is all we need to make radical change. I don't know if that's true anymore, but that was an old adage. So how do we simultaneously empower labor as we're working toward the PRO Act? Do you think that the success of a PRO Act would empower labor enough that more people would feel that union membership and union formation is a valuable thing?
I think this is a process, right? I think we're going to need to strengthen the labor movement to win the PRO Act, and that the PRO Act will strengthen the labor movement. I think that we have to be built like we are we need to organize as workers to win the PRO Act. We need to be talking to our coworkers. We need to be talking about the importance of organizing our workplaces. We need to be organizing our workplaces as we're having these conversations about the PRO Act to set the precedent for passing it. And so I think that as we're building this movement, we're building a stronger labor movement. And we're already seeing this. We're seeing that unions are coming out stronger. They're standing up against bad Democrats. For example, IUPAT recently came out and said, we're not going to give a dime to anyone who does not support the PRO Act. So we're positioning them in a way where it's like a more militant and like drawing a stronger line. And we're building up our power as like rank and file workers as we push unions, and so we push the labor movement as we push non-union workers to fight for this. And then once we pass the PRO Act, that will open up even more opportunity for us to strengthen the labor movement.
I'm sure that employers are spending a bundle of effort and money in combating the PRO Act. What are their most powerful arguments, and how can we as eco-socialists combat those?
One of the most persistent talking points against so far has been about the role of freelancers, people who are not, employees of any organization, but just have their own income. Yes, I see some on this call. So based on Prop 20, or I forget which law in California, but there was a similar bill in some ways to the PRO Act that would expand labor rights. That was successfully lobbied against by Uber and Lyft and other big companies because they really played up how it would limit freelancers in certain ways, which was mostly in bad faith. Like there was I think maybe some fair critique in that particular bill. I could be wrong completely about that, but basically they're using the same talking points against the PRO Act, saying that something called the ABC test within the PRO Act would force freelancers to, join a union or something. Whereas actually it just creates the possibility for many more workers, including independent contractors, to be able to form a union and gain access to those protections. It's being framed as an imposition on forcing all these independent workers who are, doing their small businesses and, using a lot of very individualist language to misrepresent what it actually does. So there has been a coordinated effort from some freelancer networks to form swarms on Twitter against politicians who support it, against DSA members, and we've actually pretty well organized our own network of DSA freelancers to push back on those talking points pretty effectively. So in recent weeks, we've seen, I think, Mark Warner in Virginia and Kristen Sinema in Arizona, reuse those same talking points that have been pretty effectively debunked, including by some freelancer union organizations that have come out in favor of the PRO Act.
Certainly a lot of precedent for that. And speaking of precedent, we're working as eco-socialists. I mean, we're green activists and labor activists together. Can you talk a little bit more about how we're insinuating that message when we're talking to labor who may not have ever thought of them, with any interest about climate or the environment? How are these messages being presented to always keep that eco-socialist message front and center? Because to us, that's, that's our raison d'etre. That's what we're all about.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we need to just keep emphasizing a lot of the talking points that we've laid out here. How workers will not be, an afterthought. Labor is not just something to figure out how to give some favors to or something in a transactional way. We need to just really be there from the beginning in the critical fights for labor, get past a lot of the mistrust that's built up over the past few decades by just really throwing down for fights where workers and environmentalists stand to gain. So I mean that requires a lot of work and putting in the work to build that trust, but I think just engaging as much as we are in the ProAct fight is going a long way toward demonstrating that, and we'll keep figuring out how to build from that going forward.
Can you think of any precedents for a labor climate coalition working together successfully? I'm sorry, Sydney.
Yeah, I think it is possible. I have to believe it's possible. And that is because, you know, and this kind of goes back to the messaging too. I think a lot of capitalists are really good at dividing us. They're really good at saying this group, it's not us that's the enemy. It's like climate people are the enemy, or the workers are the enemy, and they're pitting each other, when it's us, the working class, that versus the capitalist class. And I think the reality is, it's not like we are in partnership with labor unions. But we are workers. We are fighting for ourselves. And we as workers have a wide variety of interests, such as saving the planet and having a world where we can all thrive. And so I do think it is possible. I think it's going to take a lot of hard work. It's going to take a lot of difficult conversations. We're already seeing, like with IUPAT, that they're moving forward. Of course, there's like the trade unions for energy democracy and Blue Green Alliance, and you know, the nurses and the teachers have already shown like interest in throwing down for climate in various ways. There's already the beginnings of this happening, and I think that's really, really important. We just have to keep working on it.
We had a question about youth, and is there any ProAct Green New Deal campaign making connections with youth groups and youth movement organizations? Are they part of this too, since they're the future workers of America?
I mean, Sunrise is on the steering committee, if you count them as a youth group.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would count them as a youth group. I think they probably count themselves that way. So yeah, Sunrise is great to have as a core member of the coalition. DSA has a whole youth branch, YDSA, that is also involved, and we'll be talking more about how to keep building in the months forward if the ProAct does not pass in the Senate in the next month or two.
Mm. We have a good question here about the original Wagner Act, the National Labor Relations Act, and it says it excluded farm workers and domestic workers from protection. Does the ProAct correct that exclusion?
No, I don't believe it does, but Ted is the labor lawyer.
No, we still have work to do. And one of the reasons why farm workers were excluded from the act in the beginning was because a lot of the agricultural labor was in the South, and it was like part of the racialized capitalism that we have in this country, that the political coalition of the New Deal included Democrats in the South who were, basically in favor of the Jim Crow system that had persisted there for so long. So, when this thing passed, when the National Labor Relations Act was first enacted, farm workers were excluded. In some states now, there's state laws that protect farm workers or allow them to organize, but they're generally weak, and they're not as good as the National Labor Relations Act could be, especially if it's amended by the ProAct. So, this isn't going to fix everything. There are other ways in which the battle will continue, but it will really change the way that the labor law works, that is currently federal labor law.
Thanks, Ted. We have a question from Mary Finneran, who is a climate activist as well as a teacher in New York State. She points out that divestment campaigns from fossil fuels are very strong in many unions. And she's wondering if you've appealed to any of the environmental NGOs that have strong union backing. And she mentions New York Renews, which is one that I know quite well, and We Act as potential partners in the work.
A lot of the local work, we are leaving like local partnerships up to local chapters. And a lot of people are turning out different climate and union groups to their actions. I mean, that's just a function of the way that DSA operates, in that we are, highly decentralized, and a lot of work happens at the local level. So I can't really speak for New York, whether they've reached out to New York for news. I do know that a lot of different climate groups have signed on in support of the PRO Act already. I know that a lot of unions are signing on in support of climate things, and that's all really, really promising. Right now, I think our work at the national level is to make DSA strong enough to hold these partnerships and hold like authentic relationships with these groups. Because not just sitting, I work for a nonprofit, and I love my job. I have a great job, admittedly, but I know how nonprofits work, and I know how coalitions work, and there's it feels like a lot of rearranging decks on, like chairs on the deck of the Titanic sometimes, where we're not building, base building and recruiting new people, but we're just like having different staffers change. And so I hope that our work is strengthening DSA to build real relationships and real partnerships, so that we can authentically build our movement and make it grow.
Speaking of making it grow, can you talk a little bit about any international global connections that you've made? And this year we're looking toward COP26 in Glasgow, which will probably follow in its predecessor's footsteps and be basically full of hot air. But Biden just had this summit, climate summit, international climate summit. Do you see any way forward to bringing the labor solidarity issue onto the global sphere, since our economies are so capitalistically connected?
That's a very good question. I don't want to get too far ahead of conversations that are happening yet, but we have been in touch with contacts in a few different international organizations. Like in the UK, we've talked to some of the folks who are on the Corbyn wing of the Labour Party, who made a Green New Deal equivalent in the UK, a core part of the platform. So we're definitely interested in seeing what we can do with them, since they're based in the UK, which is where the next COP will be. I know there are also folks in DSA's international committee who are building links with socialist parties in Latin America, or left parties in Brazil and Bolivia and otherwise. So I think those are the kinds of connections that we want to build more, because some of the most important global climate advocacy is coming from global South nations. So yeah, I don't want to say too much now before those relationships are solidified, but those are the kinds of contacts we're trying to make in DSA.
So while we're on really big picture questions like, how are we going to unite the entire world? And I think you said the slogan is workers and the world unite. I have a question about the Green New Deal, which, you are both very active in DSA's Green New Deal work, and have brought that issue to the top of the agenda of DSA nationally. And that's really, a major development for the socialist movement, to actually have a large organization of socialists that has, a commitment around ecosocialism, and adopted, the ecosocialist principles for a Green New Deal. But I'm wondering how now you're viewing, this is a like a real big picture question, how you're viewing the Green New Deal. I mean, this is like step one of the Green New Deal right now, is fighting for the PRO Act. And it seems like that's been identified. But, how does this roll out over time? And I guess, is the Green New Deal a metaphor? Is it a decade? Is it a program? Is it a series of legislative acts? Is it a movement? What's your vision?
That's a really critical question. We certainly do not have all the answers right now. I mean, I'll just say, in our campaign, we've just really adapted in the past 2 years, since it became a DSA national priority, to what we thought the conditions were. So for much of 2019 and early part of 2020, we were all in for Bernie, because the Bernie Sanders campaign was like an actually strong climate program and Green New Deal that, if he had somehow won, we would be in a very different place right now in the first 100 days of this administration. But obviously that didn't happen, and then COVID happened, so we had to adapt again very quickly. So over the course of the year, it just became clear that building stronger climate labor connections was the most important way we could intervene as an organization. So that's why the PRO Act became a core focus for us. But in the longer term, it's really hard to say. I'll just share an article that's shaped a lot of our thinking from our comrade Thea Riofrancos, called Plan, Mood, Battlefield, Reflections on the Green New Deal, all about how we see the Green New Deal as a terrain of political struggle. It's not, as of now, it's not, a doctrine or like clear bill that has like a whole program laid out. Like even in the resolution that AOC and Ed Markey have reintroduced in the past week, there's still a lot that's very open-ended. So, we see that, the right wing has been thoroughly attacking the Green New Deal over the past 2 years as this like ultimate boogeyman, whereas Democrats in power have been running away from it. And it's really just a handful of progressives in Congress who are, presenting it as a positive program and sticking with it. So a lot of the public, a lot of people just have never even heard of the Green New Deal. They still don't know what it is because they don't see Democrat politicians running on it. The people who do know more about it are on the right, who see it being vilified. But even with that, when the public is polled, people across the board, majorities in both parties, want climate action. So, we see the Green New Deal as, a broad vision that, will be filled by whoever is organized to fill out the details. So that's why we see it as an important terrain to contest. Like sometimes we talk to folks on the left who are just like, oh, well, the Green New Deal, that's just a capitalist program to, like greenwash and, do imperialism all over again, which sure, it could end up that way. But right now, nobody's even organizing to do that from among the capitalist class. So yeah.
So in terms of movement on the union front, and unions taking an interest in the Green New Deal, notice that the announcement that Joe Manchin was actually going to support the PRO Act took place at a press conference sponsored by the United Mine Workers of America and Cecil Roberts. And I know Cecil Roberts because he showed up at the Labor Network for Sustainability Convergence, which was attended by 250 people a couple of years ago, unionists and Greens together. And he was really an interesting speaker because he was definitely coming from hardcore labor background. And he talked about the days in which the mine workers had to organize in towns that were basically where you had to buy your goods at the company store. I mean, it was like, right out of, the labor history, kind of living labor history. And the mine workers are now facing extinction as, as a union and as a occupation. And the mine workers are actually facing up to this. And he said things that were just amazing to me. I mean, I saw, in the newspaper, it came through, and he said, I think we need to provide a future for people who are displaced, a future for anybody that loses their job because of a transition in this country, regardless if it's coal, oil, gas, or any other industry for that matter. So he's kind of like really putting forward these issues that, but he also said, I'm tired of hearing about the just transition. There's never been a just transition in this country. So it seems like, there are some labor leaders who are really, part of this struggle, who are already, very conscious and can bring some real muscle to it, and maybe had a major influence on Joe Manchin, who's aligned closely with the mine workers. What are your thoughts about that, and about how we deal with fossil fuel workers in general?
Yeah, Sydney can definitely say more about this, but I think that this is why a core part of our vision for a Green New Deal is it includes a job guarantee, a federal job guarantee for that creates a floor for all workers. So a lot of visions for a job guarantee that have been put forward focus on workers who are currently unemployed or underemployed. So it would create a minimum salary floor of, like $15 or more minimum wage, which is really important for, workers who would really benefit from that. But that's not the part of a job guarantee that would be for, fossil fuel workers and extractive workers right now who, are paid pretty well across the board. And have good union wages and jobs. So that's why a just transition jobs program would be really important. That matches salary and benefits in a new job, including job training, or just provides those wages even during a transitional period where they're not employed, if the sectors they work in are phased out. So like obviously there are huge political challenges toward making a program like that happen, which is why we think this on some level just has to be demonstrated in some way, whether it's through state level programs where clean energy jobs are built out in a way that have really good salaries and benefits from the beginning that become attractive jobs for workers in other sectors, or just there's sequencing to figure out. But that's why labor unions really have to be driving the formation of programs like that. So this is an opportunity for unions to just get in there and lay the terms for how this should happen, rather than kind of tailing whatever Democrats feel like they need to concede.
Sydney, you're in Los Angeles, right? So I'm wondering, we here in Northern California, we have about half the refinery capacity in the state, and there's just transition meetings going on now that involve unions and ecosocialists and Greens and just a real variety of groups that are based in the communities that are affected by the refineries. And I'm wondering if something similar is happening in Los Angeles, and whether DSA is looking at being a part of any of that.
So I will say, I didn't think I was going to live in Los Angeles this long. I thought I was going to move this last year, but the pandemic happened. But I ended up here, being stuck here. But I'm still a little bit more divorced from what's happening in that sphere than I used to be. That being said, I know that back in 2016, we had started launching a program to bring unions and different organizations and EJ groups together to come up with a plan to decarbonize Los Angeles by 2030. Some of those efforts fell apart, but some of them are continuing. I think there's still a lot of work to do, but that work is happening just maybe a little bit too slowly. I know that one of the first meetings I ever went to at City Council was for establishing a buffer zone between having an oil well in a school and somebody's house, a 1,000-foot buffer zone, which is highly contentious. And they had all of the workers come in their uniforms to testify against it in Los Angeles. That was one of my first City Council meetings in Los Angeles. And that was only a few years ago. And so, yes, I think that there is some conversation happening, but there's a lot of work to do. And I do hope that DSA will be part of doing that work. And I hope that we're proving ourselves through this campaign as allies, and that we're not just here as allies, but as people who are deeply invested in the outcome, because we are workers as well.
So I've got a question here from Bill. I'm looking for Bill's question here. What happened to Bill's question? There it is.
It was about the connection between the infrastructure bill and the Green New Deal.
Yeah. So let me comment that basically, okay, there's this huge infrastructure bill right now that includes lots of things that would be part of the Green New Deal if they were done the right way, and would be part of the nightmare of the burning planet if they're done the wrong way. And so I'm wondering, how are we in any position right now to be putting pressure on the shape of that bill? And, or is that something that we really we have to get to another stage? We can only do one campaign at a time. I'm wondering how you're thinking about that.
That's a great question, and we are figuring out our plan to approach that. because yeah, that's going to be a big fight in the months ahead. So we're still collecting information, figuring out what our best approach should be. But as far as we've heard, the Biden climate plan includes a commitment to the PRO Act on paper. So we want to make sure that that is a non-negotiable part of whatever is presented in the next few months. We've already built up, very strong commitments across our entire organization to, keeping that an ongoing fight, no matter what form it takes. It seems like that could become part of the climate infrastructure bills. And in addition to that, there are a number of core commitments our Green New Deal campaign has made, including to public control of power utilities. And we want to figure out how to build that demand into whatever's presented, because that's not a general commitment to the Democrats have. But we think that there's strong, interest from across TSA chapters and the allies that they've built in their public power campaigns around that. Also investments in public transit versus just expanding electric cars everywhere. That's another important fight, because public transit systems have been under attack for many years, including in the past year. So another wave of austerity could threaten those systems, and also investments in green public schools and public housing. I think those are critical components that, already a few, squad members in Congress have presented pretty solid bills. So we want to look at how we might be able to support those.
Yeah. Sorry.
Go ahead.
I'll just quickly add, yeah, I think everything Ashik said, I agree with. I'm just going to quickly say that this is a historic opportunity, just because of where we are as far as like the climate emergency and like the necessity of immediate action. And Biden is promising historic investments in clean energy infrastructure, but who benefits from that, who is empowered by that, is still up for grabs. And that is why it is so important to have a left that is fighting not only for the PRO Act, but definitely for the PRO Act, but for a vision that actually make sure that workers and the working class at large are the benefactors of this payday, this investment. And this is also an important thing, because we know, based on the election and the recent attempted coup, that like this is a moment of political instability. And I think that people are going to try and be cautious about it. But this is also the type of moment when people can actually rise up and make real change. Like when there is political instability at like the top, like the ruling class level, this is when we are best positioned to intervene and force their hand. So we shouldn't miss the opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
Okie doke. And Jean McGuckin, did you want to address a question? Go ahead and unmute yourself. Go ahead.
Yeah. I'm in Vancouver, and I'm a retired paper worker. Working at a paper recycling mill, although it wasn't very environmentally friendly. We threw all kinds of crap in the river besides. Anyway, but I've been involved in socialist organizing for about 40 years now, and the Green New Deal seems to me to be an intrinsically socialist enterprise if it's done right, the way that it's done in the different countries, in the States, in Canada, and Britain, and Europe, and stuff like that. A lot of it is attempting to build bureaucracies that will, maybe do good things, but enrich some people along the ways. But I can't help thinking about the similarity between trying to get things happening in a plant around union struggles and trying to get things happening in a city around environmental struggles. You got to take people into lunchrooms and sit down and talk to them. You got to go and have meetings in the park over the picnic table and do stuff, right? Like you got to start having committees that are formed by people in neighborhoods that can start talking about these things, not just continue to have to talk about it as ways of pressuring CEOs and Democrat or election candidates. So I'm wondering if the DSA people have talked about this dynamic of trying to get it grassroots organizing at the community level.
Yeah, so I mean, I'll talk a little bit about that. DSA is dedicated to building working class power, and we believe in building power in the institutions that we are already embedded in. So we are already organizing in our apartment buildings as tenants, as workers, as students, as, you know, everywhere that we are is where we are organizing and building power. And yes, we are doing a pressure campaign. And of course, the phone bank is like the big thing that is being, you know, highlighted because it did flip senators, right? But it's not like that's going to just suddenly change everything that we need it to change. That is also why we're doing like in-depth trainings with people about like how to talk to your coworkers and how to like map out your workplace so that you can have these conversations, and or how to move your union or get involved in your union so that you can have these conversations. I know that in Ecosocialists, one of the things that we push the hardest is relational organizing, because we do see that as important. And it's hard to hold the contrast of the climate emergency with the hard and like real work of just the relational organizing that you're talking about. But yes, that is the work that we are doing, because that is how we see that we build power to actually win these things.
I think that's a good note to end on. Unless there's one other question. David Klein, did you have something you wanted to bring up?
No, I just mentioned some of the stuff that's going on in LA in the chat there around a study called LA 100, which outlines several scenarios for Los Angeles City to go to zero emissions by various states. The earliest date proposed is 2030.
Is that from Mark Jacobson's work or separate?
Well, not directly. There was an independent study conducted partly by LADWP, Department of Water and Power, with an outside agency. I forget which one it is. Maybe Sydney or somebody else knows. But that's it seems doable. I mean, it seems like it's, you know, it's going to be a steep climb, but it seems possible.
Just requires the political will, which, as we all know, is involves all this hard work that we're talking about. So Sydney and Ashik, would you like to wrap up with any final thoughts?
Yeah, really appreciate all of you joining us for this conversation. I would say if folks don't have other plans in the next hour, you should definitely join this call that Sydney and I will be leading for an update about the campaign. You can go to bit.ly/proactupdate for the registration.
And since that's case sensitive, that's all lowercase letters. There you go.
Yep.
All right. Thank you so much. This has been a very enlightening session, and we'll be putting it up on YouTube after a little bit of editing, trimming, and adding some music maybe at the beginning with Ann Feeney. There's a War on the Workers. I don't know if you know the song, but it's a really great anthem. Talk to you later.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure being here.
Bye-bye all.
Thank you.
It's a war on the workers. War on the workers. Oh, it's a war on the workers. War on the workers. Oh, it's a war on the workers, and it's time we started calling the shots.